They called her the most beautiful woman in the world, but behind the glamour of Hollywood, she hid a secret no one wanted to believe, a secret that could change the course of the war. While the world watched her on the silver screen, she spent her nights designing what would one day become Wi-Fi, GPS, and Bluetooth. A brilliant mind ignored because she was a woman, and forgotten by history. Her name was Hedy Lamarr, and what she created connects you right now. In 1940, while most of Hollywood focused on entertaining troops and selling war bonds, one actress was working on something that would change warfare forever. Her name was Hedy Lamarr, and the world knew her as the most beautiful woman in cinema. What they didn't know was that behind those striking features was a mind that understood weapon systems, radio frequencies, and military strategy better than most engineers. Hedy sat in her Hollywood mansion, surrounded by drawing boards and technical manuals that seemed wildly out of place, next to the glamorous movie posters bearing her face. She was supposed to be preparing for her next film. Instead, she was obsessing over a problem that was costing Allied lives every single day. German U-boats were destroying American ships with terrifying efficiency, and the Navy had no way to stop them. The problem was simple, but deadly. American torpedoes were supposed to be controlled by radio signals, allowing ships to guide them toward enemy submarines. But the Germans had figured out how to jam those radio signals. Every time the Navy tried to steer a torpedo remotely, the Germans would detect the frequency, blast it with interference, and the torpedo would veer off course, or worse, circle back toward the American ship that fired it. Hedy understood this problem intimately, and not because of her Hollywood career. In her previous life, a life she'd tried to leave behind, she had been married to Friedrich Mandl, one of Europe's most powerful arms dealers. Mandl had forced her to sit through countless business dinners, where Nazi officials and military contractors discussed weapons technology. While they assumed the beautiful young wife wasn't paying attention, Hedy was absorbing everything: torpedo guidance systems, radio frequencies, jamming techniques. She'd escaped that marriage by drugging her maid, stealing her clothes and fleeing to London, eventually making her way to Hollywood. But the knowledge stayed with her. And now, as German submarines terrorized the Atlantic, that knowledge wouldn't let her rest. There has to be a way, she muttered to herself, sketching yet another diagram. If the signal could change frequencies faster than the enemy could track it, her butler knocked on the door. "Miss Lamarr, Mr. Antheil is here for your dinner party." George Antheil walked in, composer, pianist, and Hedy's neighbor. He was known in Hollywood for writing film scores, but like Hedy, he had a secret passion: inventing. The two had bonded over their shared love of tinkering with mechanical devices. "George, forget dinner," Hedy said, barely looking up. "I need to show you something. I think I found a way to make radio-guided torpedoes unjammable." George raised an eyebrow. Most people would have laughed at a movie actress claiming to solve a military engineering problem. But George knew Hedy was different. "Unjammable? That's impossible. The Germans just need to find the frequency and flood it with noise." "Not if the frequency keeps changing," Hedy replied, her eyes lighting up. "Not if it changes so fast that by the time they find it, it's already moved to a different frequency, like..." She paused, searching for an analogy George would understand. "Like a piano roll," George said suddenly, understanding flooding his face. "Like a player piano. The frequency could hop from one to another, following a predetermined pattern, just like the holes in a piano roll tell the piano which notes to play." Hedy smiled. "Exactly. But both the torpedo and the ship would need to have the same song, the same pattern of frequency changes, synchronized perfectly. Can we do that?" George sat down at her drawing table, excitement building. "I think we can. I've been working with automated player piano mechanisms for years. If we could miniaturize the concept..." Neither of them knew it yet, but they had just conceived the basic principle of what would eventually become Wi-Fi. Bluetooth, GPS, and virtually every wireless technology in the modern world. But first, they had to convince the US Navy that a Hollywood starlet and an avant-garde composer had solved their biggest nightmare. That, as it turned out, would be the hardest part. To understand why Hedy's idea was so desperately needed, you need to understand the hell that was the Battle of the Atlantic. From 1940 to 1943, German U-boats were winning the war beneath the waves, and they were doing it with devastating efficiency. Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell stood on the bridge of the USS Benson, staring at the oil slick and debris that marked where the merchant ship SS Robert E. Lee had been just minutes before. It was the third ship in their convoy destroyed in as many days. Somewhere beneath those dark waters, a German submarine was reloading its torpedo tubes, preparing to strike again. Sonar contact bearing 270. The call came from below. Fire torpedoes 1 and 2. Mitchell ordered. Activate radio guidance. The Benson's torpedoes launched with a hiss of compressed air. In theory, Mitchell could now guide them directly to the U-boat using radio signals. In practice, he knew what was about to happen. He'd seen it dozens of times. Within seconds, the radio operator reported, "Sir, we're being jammed. I've lost control of the torpedoes." Mitchell slammed his fist on the rail. The expensive, sophisticated torpedoes his ship carried were useless. The Germans had detected the radio frequency and flooded it with interference. His torpedoes were now blind, wandering in circles until their fuel ran out. Meanwhile, the U-boat escaped. Again. This scene played out hundreds of times across the Atlantic. The United States had invested millions developing radio-guided torpedoes and bombs. The technology was brilliant in theory. Allow a ship or aircraft to guide its weapon to the target using radio signals, ensuring accuracy even in rough seas or poor visibility. But there was a fatal flaw. Radio signals traveled in straight lines on specific frequencies. If the enemy could detect that frequency, they could jam it. And the Germans had become masters at jamming. The statistics were horrifying. In 1942 alone, German U-boats sank over 1,000 Allied ships, more than 6 million tons of shipping. American sailors called the east coast of the United States Torpedo Junction, because so many ships were sunk within sight of land. The bodies of merchant sailors washed up on beaches from Maine to Florida. The Allies were losing the war at sea, and they were losing it because of a simple technical problem. Radio signals could be jammed. Every frequency the Navy used, the Germans could block. It was like trying to have a conversation while someone screamed in your ear. The message couldn't get through. Military engineers had tried everything. They experimented with wire-guided torpedoes, but the wires broke or tangled. They tried infrared guidance, but it didn't work underwater. They attempted visual guidance systems, but they were useless at night or in bad weather. Some scientists suggested using impossibly high-power transmitters that could punch through jamming, but that required so much power it wasn't practical for shipboard use. The problem seemed unsolvable. If you used radio guidance, the enemy could jam it, period. Every military engineer in America had accepted this as an immutable fact of physics. Everyone except a movie star who had escaped from Nazi-controlled Austria with stolen engineering knowledge and a determination to fight back against the regime that had destroyed her homeland. Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil made an improbable team. She was a glamorous Austrian actress who'd appeared in scandalous European films before becoming a Hollywood star. He was an eccentric composer known as the bad boy of music for his avant-garde performances. Both were celebrities, but both had secret intellectual lives that went far beyond their public personas. They began meeting regularly in Hedy's home, working late into the night on what they called their secret communication system. Hedy handled the theoretical framework, how to make radio frequencies hop in a way that would be impossible to jam. George focused on the mechanical implementation, how to actually build a device that could switch frequencies fast enough. The key is synchronization. Hedy explained, drawing diagrams on her sketchpad. Imagine the torpedo and the ship both have identical piano rolls. The holes in the roll represent different frequencies. As the roll spins, both devices change to whatever frequency the holes indicate. They're always changing together, always on the same frequency, but that frequency is hopping around unpredictably. How many frequencies would we need? George asked. The more the better, Hedy replied. If we use just a few frequencies, the Germans might get lucky and jam the right one at the right time. But if we use dozens of frequencies, changing rapidly, they'd never catch us, George finished. By the time they detected one frequency and started jamming it, we'd already be on a different one. It was an elegant solution, but implementing it would be fiercely challenging. They needed a mechanism small enough to fit inside a torpedo, but precise enough to switch between frequencies in perfect synchronization with a transmitter on the ship. The slightest deviation in timing would cause the torpedo and ship to be on different frequencies, breaking the connection. George's experience with player pianos proved crucial. He understood the precise mechanical timing required to play complex music automatically. What if, he proposed, we use miniature piano rolls, not to play music, but to control the frequency-hopping pattern? The holes in the roll would trigger relays that changed the frequency. Hedy immediately saw the brilliance. Player piano technology was well established and incredibly precise. They could encode a complex frequency-hopping pattern on a roll, and if both the torpedo and the ship had identical rolls spinning at exactly the same speed, they would always be synchronized. They decided on 88 frequencies, the same number as keys on a piano. It was George's little joke, but it was also practical. With 88 frequencies hopping randomly, the probability of the Germans successfully jamming the signal was astronomically small. For months, they worked obsessively. Hedy would study engineering textbooks during the day, between film shoots, then work on their invention at night. George composed during the day and engineered during the evenings. They built prototype mechanisms, tested timing systems, and refined their design. People think I'm just a pretty face, Hedy said one evening, frustration evident in her voice. Louis B. Mayer told me I should stick to looking beautiful and leave thinking to men. Even my own studio doesn't know I'm doing this. Let them underestimate you, George replied. When we're done, this invention will save thousands of lives. That's worth more than any movie role. By late 1941, they had a complete design. It was innovative, practical, and theoretically sound. They just needed to get it to someone in the military who would take it seriously. And that meant overcoming the biggest obstacle of all, convincing military brass that a Hollywood actress and a composer could solve a problem that had stumped the Navy's best engineers. On December 1st, 1941, Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil filed U.S. patent number 2287 for a secret communication system. The patent described their frequency-hopping spread spectrum technology in detailed technical language. It was revolutionary, potentially the most important military invention of the war. 6 days later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America was now fully at war, and the need for Hedy's technology was more urgent than ever. She reached out to the National Inventors Council, a government organization that evaluated civilian inventions for military applications. The council's response should have been enthusiastic. Instead, it was dismissive. Miss Lamarr, the letter read, your idea shows creativity, but it's impractical for military applications. The mechanism would be too heavy for use in torpedoes. We appreciate your patriotic spirit, but we suggest you can better serve the war effort by using your celebrity to sell war bonds. Hedy was furious. She knew her design was sound. The player piano mechanism could be miniaturized. She'd done the calculations. But she was hitting a wall of prejudice that she couldn't break through. To the military establishment, she was a movie star, not an engineer. Her beauty and fame, which had opened so many doors in Hollywood, now became barriers to being taken seriously. George faced similar dismissal. When he tried to explain the concept to Navy officials, they nodded politely and then ignored him. An avant-garde composer talking about torpedo guidance systems. They assumed he was eccentric at best, delusional at worst. They won't even look at the actual design, George complained. They hear Hollywood actress and composer and they stop listening. It doesn't matter that the invention is brilliant. The prejudice went deeper than just their professions. Hedy was a woman, and in 1942, women weren't supposed to understand complex engineering. The fact that she actually did understand it, better than most men, only seemed to make military officials more uncomfortable. They didn't know how to categorize her, so they dismissed her. There was also the lingering suspicion about her past. She'd been married to an Austrian arms dealer with Nazi connections. Although she'd fled Austria and clearly hated the Nazi regime, some officials wondered if her invention might somehow be a trick, a Trojan horse planted by enemy agents. It was absurd. Hedy had risked her life to escape the Nazis, but paranoia ran high during wartime. The National Inventors Council suggested she go on tour selling war bonds instead of pursuing her invention. Hedy reluctantly agreed, using her fame to raise money for the war effort. She was spectacularly successful. She once raised $7 million in a single night by offering to kiss any man who bought $25,000 in bonds. But it felt hollow. She knew she could contribute something far more valuable than money or morale. The rejection stung, particularly because Hedy could see ships sinking in the Atlantic every day in the news. She knew her invention could stop it. The technology was ready. The math worked. The design was practical. But nobody would give her a chance to prove it. Maybe they're right, she said to George one evening, depression creeping into her voice. Maybe I should just stick to acting. No, George said firmly. The invention is solid. If they can't see that now, eventually someone will. We just have to be patient. But patience was difficult when lives were being lost. And neither of them knew that their patent would sit unused for nearly 2 decades, gathering dust in a filing cabinet while the Navy continued to struggle with the very problem they had solved. The years 1942 and 1943 were the darkest of the Battle of the Atlantic. German U-boats reached peak efficiency, sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. American torpedoes continued to be unreliable, their radio guidance systems easily jammed. The solution sat in Patent 2092-387, but nobody in the military was interested in reading it. Hedy continued her film career, making movies that entertained millions but left her feeling empty. She'd glimpse newspaper headlines about convoy attacks and feel a pang of frustration. She'd solved this problem. Why wouldn't anyone listen? George moved on to other projects. Though he occasionally discussed the patent with Hedy, they both felt a sense of failure, as if they'd let down the sailors who were dying in the Atlantic. But something unexpected was happening. While the military ignored their invention, a few forward-thinking engineers had noticed the patent. They couldn't implement it during the war. Military bureaucracy moved slowly, and there was resistance to unproven technology from civilian sources. But they recognized that the frequency-hopping concept was genuinely revolutionary. In 1942, a young engineer named Harold Lash at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory read Hedy and George's patent. He immediately understood its significance. "This is brilliant," he told his supervisor. "This could solve our jamming problem completely." His supervisor was less impressed. "It's from a movie star and a piano player. Do you really think they understand radio frequencies better than our engineers? Have you read the patent?" Harold insisted. "It's technically sound. The math is perfect. The synchronization method is clever. This could work. Even if it works in theory, the mechanism would be too bulky. We need something that fits in a torpedo. Then we miniaturize it," Harold argued. "The war won't last forever. When it's over, if we develop this technology, it could revolutionize communications." But the conversation went nowhere. The Navy was conservative by nature, reluctant to adopt radical new technologies. During wartime, when proven methods existed, even if those proven methods weren't working very well, the turning point that prevented Hedy's invention from being immediately adopted was partly technological and partly cultural. The player piano mechanism, while clever, did seem bulky for 1940s torpedo applications. More advanced electronics would be needed to implement the idea efficiently. But those electronics didn't exist yet. Transistors wouldn't be invented until 1947, and integrated circuits were decades away. The other barrier was simply institutional prejudice. Military organizations in the 1940s were deeply hierarchical and conservative. Ideas from outside the establishment, especially from Hollywood celebrities, were viewed with suspicion. It didn't matter how good the idea was if it came from the wrong source, so the patent sat unused. Hedy's frequency-hopping spread-spectrum technology, which should have been developed immediately and deployed to save lives, instead became a forgotten curiosity. The Navy continued losing ships to U-boat attacks. American torpedoes continued to be jammed, and the solution to both problems gathered dust. The war ended in 1945. Germany's U-boat fleet surrendered, and the immediate crisis that had inspired Hedy's invention passed. But the technology gap that her frequency-hopping system could have filled became even more apparent. After the war, military analysts studying the Battle of the Atlantic concluded that unreliable torpedo guidance had cost the Allies dearly. If American torpedoes had been more effective, the war might have been shorter and thousands of lives saved. The solution had been sitting in a patent office the whole time. In the late 1950s, as the Cold War intensified and military technology advanced, the Navy finally took another look at Patent 2092 SU 387. Transistors were now available, making the miniaturization of frequency-hopping systems practical. Soviet submarines were becoming a major threat, and the Navy needed secure communications that couldn't be jammed. Engineers began developing spread-spectrum technology based on Hedy and George's original concept. They didn't call it the Lamarr Antheil system. They didn't credit the original inventors. Most of the engineers developing these systems didn't even know about the 1942 patent. They thought they were inventing something new. By 1962, the Navy had deployed frequency-hopping technology on ships sent to blockade Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It worked flawlessly. Soviet attempts to jam American communications failed completely because the signals kept changing frequencies faster than they could be tracked. It was exactly what Hedy had envisioned 20 years earlier, but Hedy knew nothing about this vindication. She'd moved on with her life, continuing her acting career, marrying and divorcing several more times. She occasionally thought about her wartime invention, but assumed it had been forgotten entirely. Nobody from the military ever contacted her to say they were using her technology. George Antheil died in 1959. Never knowing that his and Hedy's invention would eventually become foundational to modern wireless technology. It wasn't until the 1990s that Hedy Lamarr's contribution began to be recognized. Technology historians researching the origins of spread spectrum. Technology discovered the 1942 patent and realized that this Hollywood actress had invented the basic concept decades before it became ubiquitous. In 1997, Hedy Lamarr received the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Pioneer Award for her invention. She was 83 years old, living in quiet obscurity in Florida. When told she was receiving an award for her contributions to technology, she was initially confused. "That old torpedo thing," she said. "I thought everyone had forgotten about that." The award presenter explained that her old torpedo thing was now the basis for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS, and cellular networks. Every smartphone, every wireless device, every piece of modern communications technology used variations of the frequency-hopping spread spectrum she had invented in 1940. Hedy was stunned. "I just wanted to help the war effort," she said. "I had no idea it would become all this." The recognition came late, but it came with a profound realization. Hedy Lamarr, dismissed as just a pretty face, dismissed as a Hollywood starlet who couldn't possibly understand engineering, had invented technology that now connected the entire world. To understand why Hedy's invention was so revolutionary, you need to understand what frequency-hopping spread spectrum actually means and why it changed everything about wireless communication. Traditional radio works simply. A transmitter broadcasts on a specific frequency, like 98.7 FM on your radio dial. The receiver tunes to that frequency and picks up the signal. It's straightforward, but it has serious vulnerabilities. If someone wants to jam your signal, they just need to broadcast noise on your frequency. Your transmission is blocked. This is exactly what happened with WWII torpedo guidance systems. Hedy's insight was that you don't have to stay on one frequency. Instead, your transmitter and receiver can hop between many different frequencies, following a predetermined pattern. Imagine trying to jam a conversation where the speaker suddenly switches from English to French to Japanese to Italian, changing languages every second in a random pattern. Unless you know the pattern, you can't follow the conversation, let alone interrupt it. In Hedy's system, the transmitter and receiver both had identical pattern keys. She originally envisioned piano rolls, but modern systems use digital codes. The pattern key tells both devices which frequency to use at each moment. They synchronize perfectly, hopping together through dozens or even hundreds of frequencies per second. To an enemy trying to jam the signal, it looks like random noise briefly appearing on different frequencies. By the time they detect a signal on one frequency and start jamming it, the transmission has already moved to a different frequency. It's like trying to hit a mosquito that teleports to a random location every split second. The beauty of the system is that even if some of the frequencies are jammed, the message still gets through on the others. If you're hopping between 88 frequencies and the enemy is jamming 20 of them, you're still communicating successfully 77% of the time. The system is resistant to jamming, resistant to interception, and difficult to detect. But Hedy's invention had implications far beyond military applications. Spread spectrum technology turned out to be the solution to a problem that wasn't even recognized in 1940. How? To let thousands of wireless devices operate in the same area without interfering with each other. Think about a modern coffee shop. Dozens of people have smartphones, laptops, tablets, all using Wi-Fi simultaneously. How do these devices avoid interfering with each other's signals? Frequency hopping spread spectrum. Each device rapidly hops between frequencies, and the chances of two devices being on the same frequency at the same time are minuscule. GPS satellites use spread spectrum to send signals that work even with very low power. Your signal is spread across many frequencies, making it resistant to interference and difficult to jam. Bluetooth devices use frequency hopping to avoid conflicts with Wi-Fi. Cellular networks use variants of spread spectrum to let thousands of calls happen simultaneously without interference. Every wireless technology that makes modern life possible, from smartphones to satellite communications to smart home devices, uses principles that Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil invented in 1940. They created the foundation for the wireless world, and they did it while trying to solve a specific military problem that the experts said was unsolvable. The tragic irony is that the technology was so ahead of its time that the people who needed it most couldn't recognize its value. It took nearly 50 years for technology to catch up to Hedy's vision and for the world to realize what she had given us. Understanding why the Navy rejected Hedy's invention reveals important truths about innovation, prejudice, and the difficulty of recognizing revolutionary ideas. First, there was the source problem. The Navy's engineers couldn't accept that a Hollywood actress could solve a problem they couldn't. This wasn't just sexism, though sexism certainly played a role. It was a fundamental bias toward credentialism and institutional expertise. In the military's worldview, important inventions came from military laboratories. established defense contractors and university engineering departments, not from celebrities. Commander Robert Shaw, who reviewed the patent in 1942, later admitted, "I looked at who filed it and thought, a movie star and a composer? This can't be serious. I didn't even carefully read the technical specifications. I assumed it was amateur work." Second, there was the mechanism problem. Hedy and George's solution involved player piano technology, which seemed absurdly antiquated even in 1942. The Navy couldn't envision how mechanical piano rolls could guide sophisticated weapon systems. They missed the key insight. The piano roll was just the implementation detail. The fundamental concept, synchronized frequency hopping, could be implemented in many ways. When electronics advanced, the same principle would work perfectly with transistors and digital systems. Third, there was timing. The patent was filed in December 1941, just as America entered the war. The Navy was focused on ramping up production of existing weapons, not developing experimental new technologies. They needed torpedoes now, not innovative guidance systems that might work someday after years of development. It was, as one officer put it, no time for experiments from amateurs. Fourth, there was the weight issue. The Navy claimed the player piano mechanism would be too heavy for torpedo applications. This was partly true with 1940s technology, but it was also an excuse. The Navy didn't want to seriously evaluate the system, so they focused on implementation challenges rather than the revolutionary concept. Fifth, and perhaps most insidiously, there was the suspicion problem. Hedy was Austrian, had been married to an arms dealer with Nazi connections, and was proposing a complex communication system that the Navy didn't fully understand. Some officials quietly wondered if this might be an elaborate deception, a way to get the Navy to adopt a system that could somehow benefit the enemy. It was paranoid and insulting, but such paranoia was common during wartime. Finally, there was simple bad luck. If the patent had been reviewed by someone like Harold Lash, who immediately recognized its value, things might have been different. But it was reviewed by conservative officers who saw an actress's name and stopped taking it seriously. One sympathetic engineer might have championed the system and pushed it through development. Instead, it was dismissed by people who never looked past the inventor's unconventional backgrounds. The real tragedy is that all these objections were surmountable. The mechanism could have been refined. The concept could have been adapted, but the Navy never gave it a serious chance because they couldn't see past their own prejudices. Hedy's experience illustrates a painful truth about innovation. Revolutionary ideas are often rejected, not because they don't work, but because they come from unexpected sources or challenge established thinking. The history of technology is filled with brilliant inventions that were initially dismissed, from powered flight to personal computers, because the experts couldn't recognize genius when it appeared in an unfamiliar package. Today, if you're reading this on a smartphone, using Wi-Fi, or navigating with GPS, you're using technology based on Hedy Lamarr's 1940 invention. The frequency-hopping spread spectrum system she designed to guide torpedoes became the foundation for virtually all modern wireless communication. The path from Hedy's torpedo guidance system to your smartphone wasn't direct or simple. After the Navy began using spread spectrum technology in the 1960s, it remained classified military technology for decades. But in the 1980s, as cellular phones and wireless networks began to develop, engineers faced the same problem Hedy had solved 40 years earlier: how to let many devices communicate wirelessly without interfering with each other. The answer was spread spectrum. The patents had long since expired, and the technology had been declassified. Engineers adapting spread spectrum for civilian use often didn't know about Hedy's original contribution. They were working from military documentation that didn't credit the invention's origins. Wi-Fi, standardized in 1997, uses spread spectrum principles to let dozens of devices share the same airwaves. Instead of fighting for one narrow frequency, Wi-Fi devices hop across a wide spectrum, dramatically increasing capacity and reliability. Bluetooth, developed in the late 1990s, explicitly uses frequency hopping. A Bluetooth device changes frequencies 1,600 times per second, hopping between 79 different channels. This prevents interference and allows many Bluetooth devices to operate near each other. The connection between your wireless headphones and your phone exists because Hedy Lamarr figured out frequency hopping in 1940 GPS. Satellites use spread spectrum technology to broadcast signals that reach Earth despite being very weak. The spread spectrum approach lets GPS receivers pick out the satellite signal from background noise, the same principle Hedy used to make torpedo guidance resistant to jamming. Modern cellular networks, 4G, 5G, use advanced versions of spread spectrum called CDMA, code division multiple access, and OFDM, orthogonal frequency division multiplexing. These technologies allow thousands of phones to operate simultaneously without interfering with each other. Every call, every text, every data download uses principles derived from Hedy's original invention. Military applications have evolved too. Secure military communications still use frequency hopping spread spectrum, now implemented with sophisticated digital systems rather than piano rolls. Modern smart weapons use spread spectrum for guidance that's virtually impossible to jam. The technology Hedy invented to sink U-boats now guides missiles, drones, and smart bombs. The economic impact is staggering. The global wireless communication industry is worth trillions of dollars. Billions of devices use spread spectrum technology every day. An invention that was rejected as impractical in 1942 became the foundation of the modern connected world, but Hedy Lamarr died in 2000 without receiving substantial financial benefit from her invention. Her patent had expired decades earlier. While she received recognition late in life, awards, honors, acknowledgement of her contributions, she never received royalties or licensing fees for technology that made countless others wealthy. There's bitter irony in this. Hedy made millions as an actress, famous for her beauty. But her most important contribution to the world, an invention that enables modern communication, brought her no financial reward. The world valued her face more than her mind, even though her mind gave us something infinitely more valuable. Today, when you connect to Wi-Fi, you might notice that some networks are named Hedy Lamarr by tech-savvy admirers who know the story. It's a small tribute to a woman who was so much more than the world recognized during her lifetime. The story of Hedy Lamarr and her forgotten invention teaches us uncomfortable truths about innovation, prejudice, and recognition. First, brilliance can come from anywhere. The person who solves your biggest problem might be someone you'd never expect, someone from outside your field, someone who doesn't fit your image of an expert. Hedy Lamarr was a self-taught inventor with no formal engineering degree, yet she understood radio frequencies and weapon systems well enough to invent revolutionary technology. If the Navy had been able to look past her Hollywood career and gender, they might have deployed her invention years earlier and saved countless lives. Second, we systematically undervalue people based on appearance, profession, or background. Hedy was dismissed because she was beautiful, because she was an actress, because she was a woman. The same characteristics that made her famous prevented people from taking her seriously as an inventor. How many other brilliant ideas have been lost because we judged the messenger rather than the message? Third, revolutionary ideas are often ahead of their time in ways that make them hard to recognize. Hedy's frequency hopping concept was so advanced that 1940s technology couldn't fully implement it. The Navy saw the piano roll mechanism and concluded the whole idea was impractical, missing that the core concept could be implemented in countless ways as technology advanced. When evaluating innovations, we need to separate fundamental concepts from temporary implementation limitations. Fourth, credit and recognition matter. Hedy's invention was eventually used, but for decades she received no acknowledgement. Engineers in the 1960s and beyond developed spread-spectrum systems without knowing they were building on her foundation. Proper attribution isn't just about ego. It's about understanding where ideas come from and encouraging future innovation. When people see that inventors from unconventional backgrounds can make historic contributions, it opens doors for others. Fifth, there's often a disconnect between what we say we value and what we actually value. Society claims to value innovation and genius, but we actually value credentialism and conformity. We reward people who fit expected patterns and come from traditional backgrounds. True innovation often comes from outsiders who see problems from fresh perspectives. But those are precisely the people we're least likely to take seriously. The tragedy of Hedy Lamarr is that she could have contributed so much more if she'd been taken seriously as an inventor. After the Navy dismissed her torpedo guidance system, she largely abandoned inventing. Who knows what other problems she might have solved if someone had encouraged her rather than dismissing her. But there's also inspiration in her story. Despite rejection, despite prejudice, despite being told to stick to acting and war bond tours, Hedy's invention eventually changed the world. The truth has a way of emerging. Revolutionary ideas eventually prove themselves, even if recognition comes long after their creators are gone. Today, Hedy Lamarr is finally remembered as an inventor, not just an actress. On what would have been her 101st birthday, Google honored her with a Google Doodle celebrating her contributions to technology. She's been inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Her frequency-hopping invention is taught in engineering schools worldwide. But the real honor would be learning the lesson her story teaches. Look for brilliance everywhere. Value people's minds as much as their appearances, and give revolutionary ideas a chance, even when they come from unexpected sources. The next Hedy Lamarr might be working in Hollywood, or in a coffee shop, or anywhere else we're not looking. And the solution to our biggest nightmares might be dismissed as crazy, simply because we can't see past our own prejudices. Hedy Lamarr deserves to be remembered not just as a brilliant inventor, but as a reminder of how much potential genius we waste when we judge people by surface characteristics rather than substance. She solved the Navy's biggest WWII nightmare. She just had to wait decades for anyone to notice. Her invention connects the world today. Maybe her story can teach us to be more open to connections we haven't yet imagined, to voices we haven't yet heard, to brilliance we haven't yet recognized because it doesn't fit our expectations. That would be the greatest tribute to her legacy, not just celebrating what she accomplished despite the obstacles, but removing those obstacles for future inventors so their brilliance isn't wasted.